Have you ever played a game to completion only to find out that at some point later on there was way more to the game than you knew? Or maybe you instead have fond memories of that experience despite not fully understanding everything because you were simply having too much fun to care. Rather than purchase many of the new games that are coming out nowadays, I instead find myself returning to a lot of old favorites, and as I do, I discover little things that I never picked up on or tried out. Usually this is because I was either more oblivious in my youth, or the game failed to explain itself in some way or another. Regardless, I return to these games because I enjoy playing them no matter how I choose to. What saddens me a little bit is when I feel like a game is unfairly criticized for being too simplistic in its gameplay when, in my eyes, that's not the case at all. Sometimes it can be a bit unfair, even sounding like they've hardly played the game period, and they just want to talk badly about it. But people approach games very differently from one another, and you can't really expect them to play the game the exact same way. So what does it mean when, say, an action game with many different unique mechanics is considered by most to be a laid-back button masher? In this video, I'm going to be talking about a game that I've returned to many times since its release in 2006. It's a title that's very close to my heart, and my experiences have evolved significantly since my first playthroughs. And I hate that most fail to see the game's combat for what it can be, unless they go out of their way to understand what it fails to explain. My name is Dax, and in this video I'll be discussing Kingdom Hearts 2, a game that I constantly hear its combat referred to as hit the X button, and then sometimes the triangle button, I guess maybe. It not only got me thinking about why so many players have this idea, but more importantly, how they obtain it over the course of a playthrough. Is it just because they don't know any better, or is the game simply failing to provide a proper explanation of itself? Kingdom Hearts 2 as an RPG is your standard fare. As you start out with nothing but a 3-hit combo at your disposal, you eventually work your way up to being a crazy powerhouse with tons of different abilities and equipment at your disposal. Over time you gain new magics to use, action abilities to modify combos, support abilities to enhance other abilities and mechanics, summons that are, well, summons. Limits, which, along with a party member, give Sora a unique sequence of abilities to use at the cost of the MP gauge, and drive forms, which give Sora completely new movesets, abilities, and different versions of existing magic. However, many elements of these things are completely ignored by most players in favor of simply mashing X to attack, triangle when prompted by the occasional reaction command, using Cure or possibly a potion to heal, and mashing X to attack in a drive form until it's been depleted. This is the absolute most common way I see Kingdom Hearts 2 played, and it has been that way since I was a child. Hell, I did the same thing back in 2006 and for several years onward. So why do so many tools get ignored? Are they not good? Do they pale in comparison to simply swinging the Keyblade a few times and moving on? Well, let's talk about it. Now, in regards to difficulty modes, there are some things important to note. In Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix, there are 4 difficulties to choose from: Beginner, Standard, Proud, and Critical. Critical mode is the only one that's unique to Final Mix. It serves as an extra hard mode that halves your HP while in return giving you increased damage so fights don't simply drag on like they would on Proud mode. It even throws a bunch of bonus abilities at you from the start, everything from Draw to Finishing Plus, so you don't feel totally overwhelmed. The main 3 difficulties present from the original game have often been considered too easy, even on Proud mode, and I've heard many people advise that you only play on Proud mode for anything resembling a challenge. So you may be thinking, does Critical being incredibly hard yet rewarding serve to help players learn the game better? Does the challenge motivate them to use every resource they have available? Well, don't worry, I'll get to that later, but for now, I'll be talking more in the context of the other commonly played difficulties. Kingdom Hearts 2 starts out slow. Really slow. And I'm not just talking about the beginning portion with Roxas. That part can play differently enough from everything else that I won't be bringing it up too much in this video. What I will say is that it does give the player a very basic idea of how combat works. Hit X to swing the Keyblade, equip abilities from the pause menu, hit square to block attacks after equipping the guard ability, and watch for reaction commands on enemies when available. All of this setup works nicely leading up to Sora, and a few tutorial screens do a fine job in explaining the basics. After you take control of Sora, you get to run around for a bit heading up Yensid's tower while defeating a few waves of Heartless. It allows you to more or less stick to the same game plan as before, all while getting a feel for Sora as it controls considerably different from Roxas. Once you leave and head towards Hollow Bastion, you gain your first drive form. When activated, Sora gains an entirely new moveset, faster run speed, and even a second Keyblade. Not only is this a big deal for the player in making the mash the X button gameplay a bit more exciting, but the cutscenes in Yensid's tower even emphasize the use of drive. This is about where any real explanation on the game's part comes to an end. Aside from a few tutorial screens explaining how to select new things in the command menu, it doesn't teach you about how to use them in gameplay. Summons are notorious for this as they are often found to be weird or clunky, and they are ditched immediately for regular attacks. Limits can go easily unnoticed as well, after being mentioned once in the Land of Dragons and never really touched on again. Now this isn't to say that the game never explains how any of the other mechanics work. In the pause menu, you can find plenty of information about how drive forms and summons are able to level up, as they all have specific requirements. In Jiminy's journal, you can find a whole section on limits and what their various stages are, as well as a general description. There are also some basic explanations of magic as well, which is to be expected. What I find disappointing is the use of tutorial pop-ups that never mention any of this information from the start. I hate to sound like I want the game to stop you every 5 seconds and show you specifically how something works. It is nice when the game lets you figure it out for yourself, but if you're going to have those pop-ups appear at all, why not feature some more important information explaining how those tools can be used, rather than dedicating 2 whole slides to MP charge and another 2 slides to equipping a sub-weapon for a drive form. Aside from drives, summons, and limits, I feel like magic gets hit by this problem too. A very common thing I see when watching more casual players is the use of Cure. In Kingdom Hearts 2, all magic takes a set amount of MP. However, Cure is unique in that it depletes your bar regardless of how much MP you have, and it forces you to wait until the bar has fully replenished. I've heard this brought up as a common complaint in that it prevents you from using Cure more often like in Kingdom Hearts 1, but why do they need to rely on Cure so much? After all, you obtain 3 different kinds of magic before Cure: Fire, Blizzard, and Thunder, and yet I hardly see these players make any use of them at all. It's even worse when I see them have Reflect available, when that's one of the most useful and convenient magics in the game, both offensively and defensively. Fire is given early on when there are lots of fights with Shadows, the most basic of Heartless enemy, and it works well as a crowd control magic. It's my go-to for dealing with these enemies early in the game, and I can even conserve some MP by doing 2 fires into a finisher, which is a broad sweeping attack. Magic can be comboed together much the same way as physical attacks, and they can even work together in different combinations such as the one I just mentioned. Would it be a good idea to have, I don't know, an extra tutorial slide pop up once you actually get Fire? Maybe explaining what makes it a unique magic from the others and at least hints of what kind of strategy it could be potentially used for? Maybe have some extra info somewhere about how magic can be used in a combo. What about a Devil May Cry-esque visual representation where once you highlight the magic in the pause menu, you can see a possible use for it? Why not do this for action abilities as well, especially those with really vague descriptions? How about summons? Now, some players might find these things a bit distracting or unnecessary. Others might click with this and discover that there's much more to the game than they thought. Combine these ideas with a better understanding of combos themselves, and you're left with a much more interesting way to approach the game's most basic set of tools. Think about a typical turn-based RPG for a second. How much time do you have to study your options? What attacks can you do? What items do you have? What abilities and magics have you obtained over the course of the game? Well, you usually have plenty of time, like as much time as you want. It's turn-based. When you acquire a new form of magic or summon or what have you, oftentimes the first thing you might want to do is try it out. You can take your time looking over your options, reading details about that new ability, studying the enemies in the fight, and so on and so forth. The action of the battle is always the same, as it is turn-based, so there's a natural urge to not only shake the gameplay up, but study what is available to the player to help the battle go as smoothly as possible. You might play an RPG where enemies are weak to certain attacks or magic. Based on the characters in your party and the enemies on the field, you can set up your own attack patterns that would be beneficial in addressing these weaknesses. You might run into an enemy that's able to charge its attacks between turns, giving you an opportunity to study the situation and guard accordingly. In an action game like Kingdom Hearts, most players don't get the same reaction. When you get a new drive form, you simply have a new drive to make combos look different until you happen to deplete your drive gauge. When you obtain Fire, you just kind of have Fire. Mashing X to attack normally works just fine with no need to shuffle through the command menu and make extra decisions. In that regard, things are treated a lot more like a standard action game rather than an RPG. Sure, you obtain lots of cool things to use in battle throughout the game, but players having access to those tools doesn't mean they're going to use them. It's not just about the act of using them, but more importantly how the game deems them necessary. When you're working with a hybrid like Kingdom Hearts 2, you have to be able to balance those different mechanics. Yes, the game is partly an action combat game and the other half is an RPG, but if you don't merge them very well, you end up with this blend of genres that, at face value, represent both styles of gameplay, but there isn't much there to make sense of it. This is where the other half of the problem lies. You see, it's not just about giving the player a few instructions to make the mechanics seem easier to understand. You need to let the gameplay give reasons for using them as well. Many games do this perfectly fine, relying on this alone without any extra instructions, letting you become more immersed in the game as a result. Kingdom Hearts 2 doesn't give much of a reason to use any of what it offers. Something I love about Kingdom Hearts 1 is that it feels like a pure blend of real-time combat, RPG mechanics, and platforming. It made all 3 of its styles feel important. Platforming was actually necessary to progress in each world, and it felt satisfying to get a new ability like high jump or glide, because it meant you could go back to almost any world and find new chests or secrets hidden away somewhere. In Kingdom Hearts 2, platforming was traded for a more complex battle system. Everything from more action abilities to give Sora interesting combos, to a more refined magic system where each spell is unique, to dry forms. I feel like all of those new mechanics should come with reasons to need them, much like the platforming in Kingdom Hearts 1. Instead, you're left with a bunch of tools that lead to the same result, clearing a room to see the next cutscene. Fights are often too short or too easy, and as players progress, they keep their habits from the early game when mashing X is the main option. This even applies to almost all bosses in the main story, and much of the strategy with them revolves around reaction commands. I can't really even say this is strategy, it's much more like a minigame where you get to watch Sora do flashy things that you're normally unable to do. And while it can still be fun, and a lot of the reaction commands are pretty cool, it does take away from the combat's potential. And this is why I love Port Royal so much. Port Royal is based off the Pirates of the Caribbean, and manages to stand out from the other worlds in a lot more ways than just its look. Soon after you arrive, there are a couple of cutscenes where the game blatantly tips you off to using magic against the pirates, as they are human and apparently more susceptible to it.
You best be saying your prayers.
Hey, watch out, they could see you! Stay away from their magic!
What for?
Weren't you listening to me before?
Hey Pete, thanks for the tip.
Blizzard freezes them in place, thunder shocks them, fire burns them, you get the idea. Not only that, but the pirates become invincible when they are in shaded areas, making the arenas you fight in have a greater deal of strategy. Up until now, most areas are just big circles or squares that you fight in, and that's really about it. So having this kind of mechanic makes things pretty interesting. You actually need to bait them into the moonlight, and from there you can use magic to keep them in place as well as do a ton of damage. Even Barbossa and Grim Reaper are affected by magic the same way as the other pirates. I'm just going to say that in my opinion, the second Grim Reaper fight is one of the few interesting and creative fights in the entire main story. When the fight begins, Grim Reaper starts out invincible as it's holding a bunch of medallions. There's a chest in the middle of the arena, and in order to do any damage to Grim Reaper, Sora has to actually steal back the medallions from him and then put them back in the chest. Using magic can stun Grim Reaper, allowing you to pick up whatever medallions he drops, and he even drops MP orbs as well. Normally he can attack you while you try to fill the chest, so it's important to freeze him, giving you an opportunity to put all the medallions back and go on the offensive. All magic works the same as before no matter what phase you're in, so you can attack him as you see fit. A reaction command is still incorporated into this fight, much like the other bosses, where Grim Reaper will start to suck up medallions before you hit him away, but it gives a good reason for setting up the various phases that the fight goes through, as they are all revolving around stealing the medallions back. I love this fight for making magic feel really useful and unique, and it's such a shame that things like drives and summons were never incorporated into other fights the same way magic was with Grim Reaper. It would have been really interesting to see situations that had unique applications for those other mechanics. Aside from all the Heartless, Nobody, and Disney bosses, there are a handful of cool fights that stand out from them. Throughout the game's story, you meet 7 members of the Organization 13. Dimix, Xigbar, Zaldin, Luxord, Syx, Axel, and Xemnas, the final boss of the game. Of course, the rest of the organization does make an appearance in Final Mix, but I'll get to that later. Now, as far as the main story goes, only Dimix and Zaldin really stood out to me personally as fights that would give me trouble when I was still new to the game, simply because I couldn't flail at them without getting punished for it. When I attacked Dimix too much, he'd retaliate and hit me. Not only that, but he had a lot of different attacks that would come in rapid succession. While there are some gimmicky things like the timed water clone phases, there aren't any standard go-to reaction commands that will net you free damage. He's the first real fight in the game that doesn't take your shit. So while this fight can be considered one that teaches the player to bait his retaliation before trying to counterattack, what reason would the player have to do this when almost every fight up to this point has had no problem with the basic jump and hit X and then triangle strategy? When I think about bosses before and after Dimix, that kind of thing works just fine. Use a reaction command to stun Jafar and do some combos. Use a reaction command to join the experiment back together and do some combos. Do some combos on Cerberus to trigger a reaction command so you can stun him and do some combos. Do some combos on Hostile Program to steal some orbs so you can use a reaction command to do some combos. Walk up to Pete and do some combo. You get where I'm going with this. Outside of critical mode, Dimix and the other organization fights do not pose that much of a threat on the main 3 difficulties. I would say there are some exclusions, like Zaldin for his Desperation move, which many players have a lot of trouble with, and most of the Roxas fight in the world that never was. Now, in regards to Final Mix, Square Enix decided to do something kind of interesting. While there was some light rebalancing here and there, they also added a few new bosses. I'm sorry, did I say a few? I meant a lot. Final Mix added things like the absent silhouette fights featuring organization members that were fought in Chain of Memories, all 13 organization members in one room that are all super boss versions of themselves, and the hardest boss in the entire game, Terror Lingering Will. On top of the bosses, they also added a completely new area called the Cavern of Remembrance, which includes significantly harder versions of normal Heartless and Nobody enemies. In the world that never was, Roxas can also be fought, whereas before it was simply a cutscene. Oh, and Sephiroth is still in from the original game. While the absent silhouette fights may be comparable to the other organization members fought in the main story, the Data Organization and Lingering Will are significantly more difficult than any other bosses present in the game. It's at this point when I see players really start to struggle, and they rely on intense grinding to feel like they have a chance. And while this is an RPG, and that mentality is completely justified, they can still do significantly better if they make use of those other tools. Let's use an example. Lexaeus is about to slap your shit in with some rocks. Do you A. Guard, B. Dodge, or C. Reflect? Well, guard doesn't work against the rocks too well, and while rolling is nice to avoid taking damage, you're not really getting anywhere with mounting a counterattack. Lexaeus won't actually become staggered even if you hit him after this. Reflect, however, proves to be extremely useful. Lexaeus makes 2 rock pillars rapidly appear before waiting an extra second and busting out a third one. Sora chains 2 reflects together with a second one disintegrating, damaging Lexaeus. Then, during the gap, he waits an extra second and does another reflect, which will also damage Lexaeus. Not only that, but the reflect can stagger him as well, giving the opportunity for a combo. This kind of fight can be so much more fun when the player has a better grasp of these kind of concepts, but how can you expect them to when they haven't needed them for almost the entire playthrough? Most bosses in Kingdom Hearts 2 will retaliate after a certain amount of hits. While at a high level, this can be abused to set up favorable situations for the player, often allowing for cool strategies to not only stay safe, but to keep the pace of the battle fast and tense. The problem is that most casual players will find this to be frustrating. I would be frustrated too if I managed to stagger an enemy and begin a combo only to see them break out and immediately hit me. This happened to me often as a kid, and looking back, I remember equipping almost every ability I had blindly, including all of my combo pluses. My combo would be too long, and before I could reach my finisher, they'd break out. Or worse, I would have dodge slash on, and then I would just eat shit. Why is this moving the game? It gave a somewhat unsatisfying sense of pace, and it felt like what I was doing wasn't very effective, but it's all I knew how to do. Nowadays, I see this as an amazing way to keep the pace of the battle fresh and interesting, and it's even reflected in how the boss acts at all times. They're not like many other bosses in the game where they give you free openings after you dodge a couple of attacks, or become stunned for long periods of time allowing you to get several combos off in a row. These guys are relentless, and you have to be patient and figure out how they work in order to successfully counter their options. I really love these fights, and they're without a doubt my favorite part of Kingdom Hearts 2. But it's their extreme differences from almost all of the fights leading up to them that make understanding them seem insanely difficult for most players. As I've said, this game easily gives the impression that you can stick with the basic strategies learned in the first couple of worlds and get by just fine. And when those strategies fail to work on the harder bosses with them breaking out of your attacks all the time, it can be seen as a fault of the game itself. Alternatively, this can be seen as a fun challenge, and while someone flailing desperately at these bosses looks really unappealing to me, I'm not going to tell them how they should be enjoying the game. But if there had been incentive to learn more of the game's combat up to this point, they could potentially have an even more rewarding and fun experience. A game like Dark Souls will force you to learn its rules and be more careful from the beginning, while Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix throws this idea at you at the very end. I know it's not a huge negative, as this is all bonus content and not even necessary for completing the main story, but it still gives the game a bit of an identity crisis. I mean, not that it didn't have one already, I mean look at this. Remember when I said I would get back to discussing critical mode and how it can teach the player differently from the other 3 modes? Oh, you don't? Oh, that's okay. It's right here. Yeah, just go click that. Okay, don't worry, I'll wait. So does critical mode help motivate the player to use all of what the game has to offer from the very start? Well, oftentimes no. Note that while people have been able to access the Final Mix version for years thanks to the use of importing or emulation, the first time the game has seen a Western release was 2014 as part of the HD collection. Since then, I've seen many different players trying out critical mode after they've been aware of it for so many years but never actually got to experience it. And sure enough, they play the game exactly how I expect, hitting X and sometimes triangle, but a bit more cautiously. And they usually die a lot. People go into it expecting a hard experience and are more forgiving of it when they are punished for mistakes, because it's meant to be hard. But along with this, they let every death slide with the assurance that it's all to be expected. And while it's fair in assuming that they will die a lot in critical mode because, well, it's true for anyone who's ever played it, the same habits from the other difficulty modes still become apparent in their gameplay. Even when there's some experimentation when using a drive form here or a party member's limit there, time and time again they resort to giving up and taking a break to grind before most fights after a couple of deaths. Maybe I just don't play enough traditional RPGs, I don't know. But one of the reasons I love playing Kingdom Hearts 2 over and over again is that I don't feel the need for lots of level grinding. I will, however, go out of my way to level up things like drive forms so I can improve Sora's growth abilities, or at least obtain them at their base level. In regards to leveling up Sora himself, killing whatever enemies I come across as I run from point A to point B makes me feel extremely powerful by mid-game, regardless of if I'm playing standard mode or critical mode, and the only major difference is my health. But no matter how quickly you can die, it doesn't change the game's fundamental design. Remember how I talked about how Port Royal is unique and that most of the game doesn't give interesting uses for Sora's tools like that? Well, just because you're on critical mode doesn't mean it's any different. And at the end of the day, if anything in the game proves to be too difficult, then grinding for level ups and healing items can be perfectly effective. Until you reach the data organization, they don't really care what level you are. Kingdom Hearts 2 outside of critical mode is not that hard. It gives almost no reason to explore the possibilities of its combat, leaving everything up to the player to choose, and as a result it's usually played in a very simplistic way. Despite the combat's potential truly shining with fights like the Data Organization 13, it rarely gets a chance in a normal playthrough without a lot of interest on the player's part. The game as a whole is not meant to be strictly an action game. If it was, all focus would have been put towards emphasizing it as such. People find interest with this game for many reasons. Disney worlds, gummy ships, long cutscenes, keyblades, Final Fantasy, minigames, spiky hair, the list goes on. The game is a weird hybrid of brands and genres that, at its core, happens to feature a pretty cool battle system that people may or may not use. I love that so many people can enjoy this game as much as I have for completely different reasons, and it helps to show how deserving it is of its praise. Most people will continue to refer to this game as a simple button masher. But you know, I can live with that.